On Christmas Day, 1989, while most of the world was opening gifts, sitting around warm tables with family, laughing, eating, celebrating, a man was dragged into a cold, empty courtyard, given a trial that lasted less than an hour, and shot dead by a firing squad before his body even hit the frozen ground properly. No appeals, no lawyers, no mercy. And the entire thing was filmed. What makes this story almost impossible to process is that just 7 days before this execution, this same man was one of the most feared, most powerful leaders on the entire planet. He had army. He had a secret police force with 500,000 informants. He had a propaganda machine so suffocating, so completely total, that millions of people had been conditioned to genuinely believe he was something close to a god walking among them. His name was Nicolae Ceaușescu. And for 24 years, he didn't just rule Romania, he owned it. The land, the economy, the media, the schools, the hospitals, the conversations people had in their own kitchens, behind closed doors, in whispered voices, because even there, you were never truly safe. But here's the part that rewrites everything you think you know about power. His fall didn't take years. It didn't take months. It didn't even take weeks. It took 9 days. 9 days to go from supreme, untouchable ruler of an entire nation to a frightened, confused old man crouching in the back of a stranger's car, desperately begging not to be handed over to the very people he had spent decades terrorizing. 9 days, that's it. If you're new to this channel, welcome to X History, and I want to be straight with you from the very first second. This channel exists for exactly one reason: to give you the real story, not the version that gets cleaned up for textbooks, not the comfortable, sanitized, made-for-school version. The actual story, told the way it happened, with all the tension, all the tragedy, and all the raw, complicated humanity still fully intact. That's what we do here, every single week. So if that's the kind of history you've been looking for, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Because what's coming up in this video alone will completely change how you understand power, revolution, and what happens when an entire population finally decides enough. Now, to understand how Ceausescu died, you first need to understand how he lived. Romania, 1965. A small, physically unremarkable man with a noticeable stutter steps into power. Nicolae Ceaușescu is 47 years old. Not tall, not naturally magnetic. He carries a nervous, twitchy energy, the kind of man you would walk past on any street in any city and forget immediately. But underneath that completely ordinary exterior lived something history only produces rarely and always regrets. An obsession with control so total, so all-consuming, that it would eventually reshape an entire country in the image of one man's ego. Within months of taking power, Ceausescu began studying the masters. He studied Stalin, he studied Mao, he visited North Korea, and rather than coming home disturbed by what he witnessed, he came home taking notes. He wanted a nation that didn't just obey him. He wanted a nation that worshipped him. And the most terrifying part of this entire story, he actually built it. Now here's where the story shifts from uncomfortable to truly, deeply dark. Because Ceausescu didn't just want control over people's actions. He didn't just want obedience. He wanted something far more invasive than that. He wanted control over people's minds, their emotions, their private thoughts, their version of reality itself. And he built an entire system to make that happen. State television in Romania under Ceausescu was not news. It was not information. It was a daily, carefully manufactured performance, designed entirely to convince 22 million people that they were living in a golden age, led by a visionary genius in the greatest nation on earth. Factories he visited were scrubbed clean and stocked with workers who had been privately coached on exactly what to say, how to smile, which questions to answer and which ones to never, ever ask. Store shelves that sat completely empty for weeks at a time would be quietly, secretly restocked with food, only on the days his motorcade was scheduled to pass through. The moment he left, the shelves went empty again. An entire country performing a lie every single day for decades. But here is the detail that makes people physically stop when they first hear it. While ordinary Romanian families stood in lines for hours just to buy a single loaf of bread, while hospitals ran out of basic medicine, and performed surgeries in freezing rooms with minimal supplies, while elderly people quietly froze to death in their own apartments during brutal Eastern European winters because the heating had been cut to save state resources. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were living inside a palace so obscenely large. It contained 1,100 rooms. 1,100 rooms. Marble imported from Italy. Chandeliers so heavy the floors beneath them had to be structurally reinforced. Hallways longer than football fields. All of it built stone by stone on the hollowed-out suffering of a population that had no voice, no vote, and absolutely no way out. And Elena. Let's stop here for a moment, because Elena Ceaușescu is one of the most extraordinary and chilling figures in this entire story. She was not simply Nicolae's wife standing quietly in the background. She was his co-ruler, his enforcer, and by almost every credible historical account, the sharper, colder, more calculating mind behind many of the regime's most brutal decisions. Elena had left school at the age of 14, barely educated by any formal standard, and yet she had herself officially declared a world-renowned chemist and scientist. She published academic papers that historians and colleagues widely believe she never actually wrote. She collected honorary degrees from universities across the world, institutions that handed them over not out of respect, but out of fear of what refusing might cost them. She demanded specific titles. She required particular forms of address. And she made decisions affecting millions of Romanian lives with the calm, unbothered confidence of someone who had never once, not for a single moment in decades, been told the word no. Together, Nicolae and Elena became something history produces only rarely: a two-headed regime, a power couple constructed entirely and deliberately out of fear. And for a very long time, it worked perfectly. But nothing built on fear lasts forever. And by the late 1980s, the cracks that had been quietly forming for years had become impossible to ignore. Ceaușescu, gripped by a strange personal obsession with eliminating Romania's foreign debt entirely, had begun exporting almost everything the country produced: food, fuel, medicine, raw materials, all of it shipped out, while the people who produced it went without. The population was not just poor. They were exhausted in a way that goes deeper than hunger. They were humiliated, invisible, treated as furniture inside their own country. They had been silent for 24 years, but silence, when pushed far enough, doesn't stay silent forever. It transforms into something else entirely, something that not even 1,100 rooms and 500,000 informants can stop. And in December 1989, in a small, overlooked city called Timișoara, that transformation finally, irreversibly began. Timișoara was not supposed to change history. It was a mid-sized city in western Romania, quiet, industrial, the kind of place that rarely makes international headlines. But in December 1989, it became the place where 24 years of compressed, suffocating, bone-deep suffering finally found its voice. It started with a single pastor. Laszlo Tokes, a Protestant minister, had been ordered by the government to vacate his home and his church. A small group of his congregation gathered outside to form a human chain around the building. Not an army, not a political movement, just ordinary people standing together, refusing to move. But word spread, and more people came, and then more. And within hours, what had started as a neighborhood dispute had transformed into something the Ceaușescu regime had never once genuinely prepared for: a real uprising. Ceaușescu's response was exactly what you would expect from a man who had spent 24 years solving every problem with force. He ordered the security forces to open fire on the protesters. And they did. The exact number of people killed in Timișoara during those first days remains disputed by historians. But what is not disputed is this: the footage leaked, the images escaped, and the world, and more importantly, the Romanian people themselves, saw what their government was willing to do to its own citizens in broad daylight. Instead of crushing the revolution, the crackdown fed it. By December 21st, Ceaușescu had convinced himself he could still turn this around. He was, after all, the man who had controlled everything for nearly a quarter century. He had faced challenges before. He had survived them all. So he did what he always did. He called a rally. Bucharest, Central Square, massive state-organized crowd, cameras rolling. The same choreographed performance he had staged successfully hundreds of times, thousands of people cheering, clapping on cue, chanting his name like a religious ceremony. He stepped onto that balcony with complete confidence. And then, somewhere in that crowd, someone booed. One sound, barely 2 seconds long, but you can watch what happens next on YouTube right now. And it is one of the most extraordinary pieces of historical footage in existence. Because in that single moment, on that balcony, in front of rolling cameras and thousands of people, Nicolae Ceaușescu's face does something it had almost certainly never done in public before. It showed confusion, his hand raised slightly, almost childlike, as if trying to physically push the noise away. His eyes moved across the crowd with an expression that was not anger. It was something far more revealing than anger. It was panic. Elena leaned toward the microphone beside him and whispered words that were accidentally captured on the live broadcast. Promise them something. That moment, that small, human, completely unscripted moment of panic, shattered the myth instantly and permanently. Because the crowd saw it. All of Romania saw it. And once you have seen the man behind the curtain flinch, you can never unsee it. The chanting broke apart. The square erupted. And within 24 hours, the revolution had consumed Bucharest entirely. The following morning, December 22nd, Ceausescu attempted to address the nation one final time from the same balcony. The crowds that met him were no longer performing loyalty. He and Elena fled by helicopter from the roof of the Communist Party headquarters, escaping with minutes to spare as protesters stormed the building below them. They landed in a field outside the city, wandered, knocked on strangers' doors, flagged down passing cars, switched vehicles multiple times. Two people who had commanded the absolute obedience of an entire nation, now reduced to desperate, frightened fugitives on the side of a road, begging ordinary citizens not to turn them in. Most of those citizens turned them in anyway. They were captured the same day and transported to a military base in Targov East, locked inside an armored vehicle for 3 days, while the new provisional government argued frantically about what to do with them. The decision they reached was swift and brutal and deliberate. Christmas Day, 1989. A military tribunal was assembled inside an empty room at the base. Plastic chairs, bare walls, a handful of military judges and prosecutors who had themselves lived under this regime their entire adult lives. The trial lasted 55 minutes. Ceausescu refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court from the very first second. He sat straight back, defiant, almost bizarrely theatrical, demanding to speak only to the full Romanian parliament, refusing to answer questions, insisting repeatedly that everything happening around him was illegal. Elena was sharper, angrier. She snapped at the judges. She called the prosecutors cowards. She looked around that bare room with an expression of pure, furious contempt, as if the sheer force of her disdain might still somehow reverse what was happening. Neither of them, not truly, not in their bones, believed this would end in execution. They were wrong. They were taken outside into a narrow concrete courtyard, hands bound behind their backs, stood side by side against a wall. The soldiers tasked with carrying out the sentence didn't even wait for the formal order to finish being read. Multiple accounts from witnesses present that day described the firing squad opening fire almost immediately, out of a mixture of urgency, nerves, and the very real fear that some last-minute order might arrive to stop it. No last-minute order arrived. Elena's final recorded words, spoken to the soldiers raising their weapons, were, "I was like a mother to you." The footage, grainy, shaky, completely uncinematic, shows two figures collapsing almost simultaneously. A courtyard going silent, soldiers stepping forward carefully to confirm what had just happened. 24 years of absolute power ended in under 10 seconds against a concrete wall on Christmas morning. Romanian state television broadcast the footage that same evening. Across the country, in apartments, in village homes, in hospital waiting rooms, in military barracks, people gathered around television screens and watched in complete silence. And then something happened that no state broadcast, no government announcement, no choreographed rally had ever once genuinely produced in 24 years of Ceausescu's Romania. People began to cry, spontaneously, uncontrollably, not entirely from grief and not entirely from joy, but from something far more complicated than either of those things. From the sudden, overwhelming, almost physical sensation of a weight being lifted that had been pressing down on an entire nation for longer than many of those watching had been alive. Romania's revolution was one of the bloodiest of the 1989 Eastern European uprisings. Historians estimate over 1,000 people died in those 9 days. Cities burned, families were torn apart. The wounds took decades to begin healing, and some, arguably, have never fully closed. But on that Christmas night, in that specific moment, what most of Romania felt was something that Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu had spent 24 years making deliberately, systematically impossible to feel free.